All right, today we're going to talk about the mechanisms of evolution. And by mechanisms, that means how evolution happens. So after Darwin started his ideas of natural selection and evolution, lots of scientists started studying it. Two scientists with the last name of Hardy and Weinberg came up with the Hardy-Weinberg principles. And they just came up with the idea that when allele frequencies remain constant, a population is in genetic equilibrium. When you hear the word equilibrium, what do you think of? Equal, or like balanced. So it means that the alleles aren't changing, essentially meaning no evolution is going to take place. And so for genetic equilibrium to be met, these 5 conditions have to be met. So you would need to have no genetic drift, no gene flow, no mutation, random mating, and no natural selection. So how often do you think this happens in nature? Where you're going to have like no mutations, no natural selection. You don't know what gene flow or genetic drift are yet, but how often do you think this ever happens? Basically never, right? Okay. Yeah, it doesn't happen in natural populations. Okay. Which means whenever those aren't met, you're going to have evolution occurring. So we call those 5 criteria the mechanisms of evolution, or these are what cause evolution. Okay, so these you do need to write down. So that first mechanism, it's genetic drift. The second one is gene flow. The third one is mutation. The fourth one is non-random mating. And the fifth one is natural selection. So then today, we're going to go through those 5 mechanisms of evolution. All right, so that first mechanism we're going to talk about, it's called genetic drift. This one, it's when you have some random change in allele frequencies due to some random chance event. Okay, so there's no like order or reason for it. A good example is just looking at this picture down here. So here you have this bug population, you have the brown bugs and you have green bugs. And the random chance event is someone's just going to step on that pile of bugs. So then if you look at what color of bugs got stepped on, what color got stepped on? The green. So then you get this random change in allele frequency where now I'm left with a lot more brown bugs and I'm left with just one green bug. Okay. Now, the key to genetic drift is it's a completely like random, unpredictable chance event. Meaning that in this situation, the green bug or the brown bug, neither one of them had like this evolutionary advantage. Neither one was like more fit for the environment. Instead, the random event, some just happened to get stepped on. Does that kind of make sense? I'm going to follow up with a few more examples too. All right, so we're going to go through some examples of genetic drift. Okay, so these next few slides, put them like under genetic drift in your notes. So our first example is called the founder effect. The founder effect occurs when you have this loss of genetic variation, and it happens when you get a new population established by a very small number. So think of the title founder effect as like a founder of a new city. Okay. So this occurs, you have your like a normal population. We have red squares, blue dots. Those are just meant to show that there's variation in that population. Well, you might have small groups leave. Okay. So maybe I'm going to leave and only the red population is going to start up. Well, is that changing the genetic variation if you only get the red? No. So that would be an example of a founder effect. You might have another small group leave, and maybe it's just the blue. Okay. Again, that has completely changed the genetic variation. So that too would be a founder effect. And then here, maybe you still have like equal numbers. So something we see in the founder effect is you might have a trait that's really rare in like the normal main population. So if you look at like our original population here, Well, it turns out if a few of them leave and start like a new population somewhere else, that really rare trait might become more prominent because you have less variation. So an example of this, in the Amish community, it is not uncommon for people to have 6 fingers. And it turns out every single person who is in the Amish community with 6 fingers, they all are traced back to the original founder of the Amish community. Okay. So in our everyday population, is having 6 fingers common or rare? Rare, right? That's super rare. But in this type of scenario, they have a founder effect going on, where you have a small chunk of that population who had 6 fingers, and then it's been passed on because you just don't have that genetic diversity. Another example of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. Okay, so this is just a second example. The bottleneck effect happens when a population in a specific area gets reduced to a very small size, usually by like predation or a natural disaster or disease, and then over time it's going to rebound. So down here we have a picture showing bottleneck. Again, the circles are just showing variation. So we have the yellow circles, we have the blue circles. Okay? So some sort of event is going to happen where that population gets like drastically reduced. Okay? So here you can see we have just a couple blue, a couple yellow. Okay? Well, not all of them are going to survive. So then you're left with your surviving individuals. I know it is tough to see on that screen, but you can see here, more of the blue have just happened to survive than the yellow. And then they are surviving, so they're reproducing, and you're getting more offspring. So then if you look here, that next generation that is rebounded, what color do you see more of? Blue, right? So you have just a change up in that variation where now I have more blue. A couple examples of a bottleneck in nature are northern elephant seals. So at the end of the 19th century, these were overhunted and reduced to down, we think about as few as 20 individual of these seals. Since then, protections have been put in place, and so now they've rebounded to over 30,000 of these northern elephant seals. However, they still show the effects of this bottleneck. So they all stem from those same 20 individual seals. And so they don't have very much genetic variation in that population, especially when you compare them to the southern elephant seals that haven't been through that bottleneck. Cheetahs are another good example of a bottleneck. So our current theory is cheetahs have become inbred when some sort of like natural disaster dropped their total population down to just 7 individuals. We think about 10,000 years ago. So all of our cheetahs have stemmed from the same 7 individuals, and in order for them to survive, they had to breed either like brother to sister or parent to child. So because of that, cheetahs are very susceptible to some diseases, and they have a lot of reproductive difficulties. Okay. So let's think about why that is. If the cheetahs, they all stem from like the seven cheetahs, okay? So there's not a lot of variation. So why do you think that they're susceptible to some diseases? Think back. You remember like a week or two ago we did that antibiotic resistant poggle? Do you all remember that? If you had something that wiped out all of these sensitive bacteria, would you have any left to survive? All right. You need some variation in some of those resistant strains to keep the population going. So cheetahs are super susceptible to diseases because it turns out if it affects one, odds are likely it's going to affect all of them because they're all so similar genetically. And then they have reproductive difficulties because they share the same recessive disorders. Remember in our genetics unit, we talked about recessive genetic disorders, and in order for it to show up, both parents would have to have it. Well, since cheetahs are so closely related, they do carry a lot of the same recessive disorders. Okay, gene flow is our second mechanism. Okay, so this is different from genetic drift. Okay, so our second mechanism of evolution is called gene flow. And gene flow, it's kind of exactly what the title is. Your genes are just flowing from one place to the next place. So this is due to random movement of individuals between populations, which is migration. Okay, if you migrate to a new population, you're going to now put your genes in the gene pool and you're going to mix it up. So here's a picture. We have the bluebird population and the redbird population. Okay, so gene flow happens when you maybe have a bluebird that migrates to the redbird population, and then you have a redbird migrate to the bluebird population. So then you just mix up your genes in that population. The third mechanism is non-random mating. So it turns out mating is almost never completely random. And the reason for that is usually you're confined to your actual location. Okay, so you're stuck with kind of who's around you to mate and to breed with. The fourth mechanism is mutation. Mutation should be familiar from our genetics unit. Yes, like we've heard that word before. Okay, mutations, they're just random changes in the DNA, and they might change the trait in the organism. It depends what type of mutation it is. And remember back in our genetics unit when we talked about mutations, mutations could either be advantageous, meaning they're going to be for the better. They could be neutral, meaning they provide no advantage or disadvantage, or they could be like a negative mutation where it's actually going to cause more harm. It might make it harder for you to survive. Okay. And so it turns out most mutations are going to be neutral or negative. Very few are actually advantageous. All right, so here's an example we've talked about in class. So mutations help produce those adaptations. So remember at the beginning of this unit, we talked about those peppered moths. So originally they are light colored, but a mutation caused them to become dark colored. Can you even see the moth right here? I know it's super hard to see. But this happens to be an advantageous mutation because now which moth blends into the tree better? That dark one, right? So in this case, the peppered moths show that mutation provided a positive adaptation to allow these moths to survive better. And then that brings us to our fifth mechanism, which is natural selection. Hopefully natural selection is something that we're getting more familiar with and more comfortable with. But natural selection is just that process in which organisms with favorable variations for the environment are more likely to survive, and then you're more likely to reproduce and pass on those traits to your offspring. And this picture should look familiar. We've seen this picture before. But here we have our bug population. We have the variation of green and brown bugs. Well, when you put them in the environment of the tree bark, which bug blends in better? The brown one, right? So which one sticks out to its predators? The green. So then the green bugs tend to get eaten more often, which leaves more brown ones to survive, to reproduce, and pass that trait on to their offspring. So then you would see a change in like the next generations are going to be more brown. All right, so finally I want to connect mutations and natural selection. So how do variations or differences occur within a population? So first of all, make sure you know mutations cause variation. Okay, so know that. So mutations or those changes in DNA are going to allow for variation within the population. And then natural selection can either favor a specific trait, okay? And then that is either going to increase the trait or decrease. So remember, not all mutations are positive. So you could have this great mutation that provides a really positive adaptation, like a dark color for the peppered moths. Or you could have a terrible mutation that makes you more at risk, and then you definitely wouldn't survive very long. All right, and then finally, I just have a picture to sum up our big mechanisms for evolution. So one of them is just mutation. So we just have a random change in the DNA that's going to change a trait, right? So we can go from green to brown. Gene flow is essentially migration. So maybe the brown bugs are going to migrate over to the green population. Genetic drift is that random chance event. So I just happen to randomly step on the green bugs and I only leave the brown ones behind. And then natural selection is when there's a reason for that. So the green ones stick out, the brown ones blend in. That's why the brown ones survive. And then the fifth one that just doesn't have a picture for it is the non-random mating.